The sound of champagne glasses clinking filled the banquet hall, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. The wedding guests in Cleveland smiled, laughed, and offered their congratulations, as if this day was a celebration of love. I sat there in my white dress, my face frozen into a polite smile, but inside I felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. My hands trembled as I clutched the bouquet, and I kept reminding myself not to cry, not here, not in front of everyone. I had dreamed of weddings as a little girl, but not like this. Not with Richard Cole. He was a man twice my age, a wealthy owner of a transportation company, respected in the city, but whispered about behind closed doors. He smiled at me as if he owned me already, his eyes calculating, sharp, assessing every move I made. To the people around us, he was a generous businessman who provided jobs and stability in a town that had lost so much. To me, he was a stranger who had barged into my life, claiming a role I never wanted him to have. My mind drifted back to my childhood, to the moments that had led me here. My parents had vanished from my life before I even understood what family truly meant. My father ended up in prison after a violent crime. My mother disappeared one night and never came back. At 8 years old, I was left in the care of my aunt, Patricia Carter. She signed the guardianship papers with a stern face, and for years reminded me of the sacrifice she had made. But Patricia hadn't raised me out of love. She raised me because of what I had inherited, my father's small apartment in the city. For years, she rented it out, pocketing the money, reminding me daily that I owed her my obedience. When I turned 18, she convinced me to sell it. We're one family, Emily, she told me. We'll build a bigger house together, with more space, a better life. Trust me. Naive and desperate for approval, I agreed. The apartment was gone within weeks, the money disappeared into her hands, and the promised house was never built. Suddenly, I had nothing, not even a legal address. Patricia made it clear, without her, I would be homeless. That was when Richard Cole appeared. He had noticed me at his company's office, where I worked as a secretary, one of the few jobs available in Cleveland's shrinking economy. At first, I tried to avoid him. His gaze lingered too long. His compliments felt more like commands. I thought about quitting, but Patricia wouldn't hear of it. "Do you realize what kind of chance this is?" she hissed one night. "A man like Richard Cole doesn't look twice at just anyone. Don't you dare walk away from this. If you leave, you'll be out on the streets. I won't keep feeding you for free." Her words stung. 12 years of living under her roof, and not once had she treated me like family. She had groomed me for this moment, selling me off like a bargaining chip. Friends at work pulled me aside, whispering warnings. "Don't do it, Emily. You've heard the stories, haven't you? His first 2 wives ended up in psychiatric hospitals. No one knows exactly what happened, but it wasn't natural." Their faces were etched with concern, but what could I say? That I had nowhere else to go? That my so-called aunt would sooner lock me out of her house than let me follow my own heart? So I sat there at the wedding banquet, smiling for the cameras, pretending to be the happy bride. I could hear Patricia laughing with the guests, soaking in their praise, as if she were the one who had secured this future. Richard placed his hand over mine, his grip firm, possessive. To everyone else, it was a gesture of affection. To me, it felt like chains tightening around my wrists. That night, I walked out of the banquet hall as Mrs. Richard Cole. But in truth, I felt like a prisoner being escorted into a life sentence. I wasn't stepping into a marriage built on love. I was stepping into the beginning of a nightmare. Richard's mansion stood on the edge of Cleveland, tucked behind tall iron gates and lined with stone walls that seemed more like a fortress than a home. As we drove up the long driveway, I felt the weight of silence pressing against me. Inside, the house smelled faintly of polish and old leather. Chandeliers glittered overhead, the kind of wealth people in my neighborhood only saw in magazines. He guided me through each room with a soft smile, pointing out the library, the dining hall, the balcony overlooking the frozen garden. To anyone else, it might have looked like the life of dreams. To me, It felt like walking deeper into a labyrinth I would never escape. Richard's tone that evening was unusually gentle. He poured me a glass of wine, told me I looked beautiful, brushed a strand of hair from my face. For a moment, I wanted to believe maybe the warnings had been exaggerated, that perhaps my new husband wasn't as cruel as people whispered. He held my hand and said, "You'll never have to worry again. You're safe with me now." But the way his eyes lingered on me, sharp, assessing, almost predatory, made my stomach twist. When it was time to go upstairs, he led me not to a warm bedroom, filled with flowers or soft blankets, but down a narrow hallway that grew darker with every step. He unlocked a heavy oak door and gestured for me to go inside. I froze the second I saw it. The room was bare, the walls painted gray, and in the center stood a metal-framed bed. Chains hung from the posts, coiled like snakes waiting to strike. A leather whip rested across the sheets, its shadow stretched long in the dim light. I shook my head, backing toward the door. "No, what is this?" Richard's smile sharpened. "This is where we begin," he whispered. "Every wife must learn her place." His voice was low, steady, with a certainty that chilled me more than shouting ever could. Panic rushed through me. I turned and bolted. He reached for me, his hand brushing my arm, but I tore free, running blindly through the halls until I found the front door. My bare feet slapped against the marble, the satin hem of my gown catching on the stair rail. I grabbed a robe from a chair near the foyer, slipped into my house slippers, and ran out into the freezing night. The cold hit me like a wall, but fear propelled me forward. I climbed the gate, scraping my palms, my breath ragged as the metal dug into my skin. My gown ripped along the edge of the iron, but I didn't care. I landed hard on the other side, my legs trembling, and sprinted into the empty streets. I didn't know where else to go but back to Patricia's house. The lights were still on, even though it was past midnight. As I approached, ready to pound on the door, I froze at the sound of voices drifting through the window. She ran. "Don't worry, I'll let you know the second she comes back." It was Patricia's voice. I edged closer, my breath caught in my throat. Through the sheer curtain I saw her standing in the living room, shaking Richard's hand. He pressed an envelope into her palm, thick with cash. My chest burned as the truth hit me. She hadn't raised me out of love. She hadn't even sold me into marriage for stability. She had traded me like property, and now she was being paid to keep me under surveillance. I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering, vision blurred with tears. My own blood, my only family, had sold me out. I wasn't just a prisoner to Richard. I was betrayed by the very woman I once called my guardian. That night, standing in the dark street with nothing but a robe and slippers, I realized I was utterly alone. The streets of Cleveland were nearly empty at that hour, but the few people I passed stared as if I were some spectacle. My wedding gown was torn, the robe I had grabbed clung awkwardly to my shoulders, and my slippers slapped against the wet pavement with every hurried step. A group of men leaning against a bar doorway laughed as I stumbled by. "Hey, sweetheart, rough night," one of them jeered. Another whistled, his laughter chasing me down the block. My cheeks burned, but I kept moving. I couldn't let anyone stop me. I had no house to return to, no papers, no money. Patricia's betrayal left me without even the illusion of family. The apartment that should have been mine was gone years ago, sold under her pressure. All I had was the thin fabric around my body and the gnawing fear that Richard's men would be searching for me before dawn. The city lights blurred through my tears as I made my way to the train station. I didn't think, I just ran. By the time I stepped onto the cracked pavement outside the terminal, my chest ached from the cold air. The ticket clerk behind the glass barely looked up when I asked about the next departure. "Outbound in 15 minutes. Doesn't matter where, it's headed west." I clutched the robe tighter around myself. I didn't even have the money for a proper ticket. Desperation pushed me forward. I scavenged a crumpled bill from the pocket of the robe. Maybe Patricia's, maybe left by accident. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the cheapest fare. The clerk raised an eyebrow at my appearance but handed me the ticket without a word. As I sat on the hard bench of the waiting area, memories pressed against me. Years ago, back in high school, a teacher had taken us on a field trip to a monastery in the countryside. I remembered the way the stone walls seemed ancient, the silence of the cloistered halls, the candles burning in the chapel. Back then, it had seemed strange and lifeless. But now, in my mind, it became something else entirely, a place of safety, far from Richard, far from Patricia, far from the shame. When the train finally pulled in, I climbed aboard with trembling hands. The carriage was nearly empty. I pressed myself into the corner of a seat, trying not to draw attention. The train lurched forward, carrying me out of the city lights and into the dark sprawl of the Midwest night. The clatter of the wheels on the tracks became a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat that wasn't mine, steady and strong, urging me to keep breathing. Hours passed in a haze. My eyelids grew heavy, my body numb from cold and exhaustion. I dozed off, waking only when the train screeched to a stop at a small rural station. I stepped down into the night, the air sharper here, the silence heavier. My slippers sank into the slush of old snow as I began the long walk toward the road I half remembered from that school trip. The memory guided me more than the landmarks did. I followed the vague image of stone walls rising against the trees, of bells that once echoed across the valley. By the time I saw a faint glow ahead, lantern light seeping from narrow windows, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I staggered toward it, clutching the robe tighter, my breath clouding in the frozen air. The monastery gates stood open, welcoming in their stillness. And for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of hope. The iron gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the silence of the monastery wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. The stone walls loomed high against the night sky, weathered by decades of storms and seasons. My legs nearly gave way, but I forced myself forward, dragging my slippers across the frozen ground. When I reached the wooden door, I pounded weakly, each knock echoing into the dark. After a moment, the door opened, and a woman in a gray habit appeared, her face lined with years but not unkind. She studied me, my torn gown, the robe clutched tight, the desperation in my eyes. Without a word, she ushered me inside. Warmth from a small fire hit my skin, and I nearly sobbed in relief. Later, I learned her name, Mother Agnes, the prioress of the monastery. She asked few questions that night. "You are safe here," she said softly. "Rest now. We will speak tomorrow." I collapsed onto a cot in the corner of the guest quarters, and for the first time in hours, I slept without the sound of my heart hammering in fear. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm I had never known before. At dawn, the bells rang, and I rose with the sisters. I scrubbed the stone floors of the chapel, washed linens until my hands were raw, and helped in the garden despite the cold. My body ached, but the monotony numbed my thoughts. No one asked where I had come from, and I offered no details. The less they knew, the safer I felt. Meals were silent, eaten at long wooden tables beneath flickering candlelight. The sisters bowed their heads, eyes lowered, lips moving in prayers I only half remembered from my childhood. I mimicked them as best I could, though my mind often wandered. In the evenings, we sat in the chapel as hymns rose and faded into the stillness. It was a world closed off from everything beyond the stone walls. At first, the quiet unsettled me. I had lived my entire life in noise, Patricia's sharp commands, the city's clamor, the laughter of people who never saw me as their equal. Here, there was only the sound of broom bristles, the drip of water into pails, the whisper of pages turning in prayer books. Slowly, I began to crave it. Silence meant safety. Silence meant no one could hurt me. Yet, as the weeks passed, I couldn't ignore the shadows that clung to the place. The corridors were cold, the air damp, the days identical. The younger sisters rarely smiled. Their eyes carried a heaviness I recognized too well, the look of women who had given up on wanting more. One night, as I lay on the cot staring at the low ceiling, I wondered if this was my fate. To spend my youth hidden away behind stone, scrubbing floors, fading into anonymity. Safe, yes. Untouched by Richard's cruelty, shielded from Patricia's betrayal. But at what cost? I pressed my hands together in prayer, though I wasn't sure if I believed anymore. Maybe this is what's left for me, I whispered into the darkness. Maybe it's better to bury myself here than to risk the world outside. The thought settled over me like the cold air, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, I began to imagine that my real life, might already be over. The morning began like so many others. The bells rang at dawn, and I followed the sisters into the fields beyond the monastery walls. Mother Agnes asked me to accompany one of the older nuns to gather wild berries along the edge of the forest. I carried a wicker basket, my hands already aching from the chill in the air. The nun hummed softly as she walked ahead, her pace slow but steady. I tried to match her rhythm, but after a while my steps grew restless, and soon I fell behind. The forest was quiet, hushed except for the crunch of snow beneath my slippers. My eyes drifted to a cluster of brambles heavy with berries. I knelt to pick them, losing sight of the nun as she disappeared further down the path. When I straightened, the air shifted. A branch snapped somewhere deeper in the trees. I turned quickly, my breath caught in my throat. From between the trunks stepped a man, thin, disheveled, his clothes torn, his face gaunt with exhaustion. His eyes locked on mine, wide and desperate. He raised his hand slowly, as though to show he meant no harm. "Please," he rasped, his voice raw, cracked with thirst. "Water. Anything." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I stared at him, frozen, clutching the basket to my chest. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, because he lowered himself to his knees, his palms pressed against the snow. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "My name is Daniel Hayes. I escaped from prison." The word sent a shiver down my spine. My mind flashed with headlines about convicts, criminals, dangers lurking in the woods. I took a step back, ready to bolt. But then he lifted his face, and for a moment I saw something different. Not the menace I expected, but a raw, human desperation. "I didn't do what they said," he continued, his voice breaking. "They framed me. Richard Cole, he set me up. The charges, arms smuggling, they weren't mine. He needed someone to take the fall, and I was convenient." The name hit me like a blow. Richard. Even here, miles away from Cleveland, his shadow stretched long enough to find me. I swallowed hard, torn between fear and something else. Could this man be telling the truth? His hands shook as he tried to rise, but his body gave out, collapsing back into the snow. He looked so fragile, as though the forest itself might swallow him whole if no one intervened. Against my better judgment, I set the basket down and reached into the small flask I carried. I knelt beside him, holding it out with trembling hands. He drank greedily, water spilling down his chin, his eyes closing in relief. That evening, I returned to the monastery, my heart heavy with conflict. But as night fell, I found myself sneaking into the kitchen, gathering scraps of bread and a worn blanket. I slipped through the gates, back into the forest, where Daniel waited. He accepted the offering with gratitude, his eyes meeting mine in a way that felt disarming. In those eyes I saw no cruelty, no manipulation, none of the cold calculation I had learned to recognize in Richard. Instead, I saw honesty, even in his brokenness. And for the first time in years, I felt something stir within me, something fragile, unfamiliar, a flicker of trust, maybe even hope. The monastery bells marked the passing of days, but inside me, time moved differently. Each morning I woke before dawn, followed the sisters through prayers and labor, and told myself I was safe here. No one knew me, no one asked questions, and no one would dare cross the gates looking for Richard's runaway bride. Safety should have been enough. But after meeting Daniel in the forest, silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like hiding. I tried to bury myself in the routines. I scrubbed harder, prayed longer, kept my eyes lowered. But my thoughts drifted constantly to him. His hollow cheeks, the urgency in his voice when he swore Richard had framed him, the way his gratitude softened his exhaustion when I brought him food. Each evening I wrestled with myself. Was I helping a dangerous man, or was I the only one who saw his truth? The secret meetings became more frequent. I would slip away after Vespers, clutching a bundle of bread, sometimes fruit or an extra blanket. Daniel always waited where the trees grew thick, his body half hidden in shadow. At first, he kept his distance, speaking little more than thanks. But gradually, our conversations stretched. He told me about his life before prison, how he had worked in logistics, how Richard Cole had been his superior, how he stumbled into the wrong deal at the wrong time. Richard needed a scapegoat, he said bitterly one night, his breath rising in the cold air. He had the money, the connections. I had nothing. I was easy to bury. The fury in his voice frightened me, but I understood it too well. I knew what it felt like to be buried by Richard's power, smothered until you could hardly breathe. Sometimes Daniel would pause, searching my face. You don't belong behind those walls, Emily. You're not meant to disappear into silence. You're stronger than you think. I shook my head. I don't have anywhere else to go. The monastery, it's the only place that took me in. It's not living, he pressed. It's hiding. You deserve better than chains or cloisters. We both do. His words echoed in me long after I returned to my cot. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, torn between fear and the flicker of something I hadn't dared feel in years. Possibility. Could I step beyond these walls and choose something for myself? Night after night I prayed, though my prayers were less like pleas to God and more like whispered conversations with myself. What do I want? I asked into the silence. Do I want safety, or do I want freedom? The questions circled endlessly, until at last an answer began to take shape. One evening, Daniel took my hand. His fingers were rough, cold, but steady. We can fight for the truth, he said. I can't do it alone. But with you, maybe we have a chance. No one had ever spoken to me that way. Not Patricia, not Richard. No one had ever seen me as someone who could choose, who could fight, who could matter. That night, I didn't sleep. When dawn came, I rose with the sisters, but instead of walking to the chapel, I walked to the gates. My bundle was small. Bread, a scarf, nothing more. My heart pounded, but my steps didn't falter. Daniel was waiting in the forest, and when he saw me, his expression shifted from surprise to relief. For the first time in my life, I wasn't obeying someone else's command. I wasn't running back into silence. I was stepping into the unknown, not because I was forced, but because I chose it. And that choice changed everything. Cleveland greeted us with gray skies and the smell of iron and smoke. The factories that still stood puffed weakly into the air, their shadows stretching over cracked streets and abandoned warehouses. Daniel walked with determination, though exhaustion tugged at every step. I followed him, clutching my coat tight, wondering if the city that had swallowed me once before would devour me again. We'll go to Victor Malone, Daniel said. He was like a brother to me once. If anyone can help, it's him. Victor's bar sat on a corner near the waterfront, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the afternoon haze. Inside, the place smelled of stale beer and grease, but warmth and noise filled the room. Men crowded around pool tables, laughter echoing too loudly. When Victor saw Daniel, he froze for a heartbeat, then broke into a grin. "Danny Hayes," he boomed, clapping him on the back. "Hell, I thought you were gone for good." His eyes flicked to me, sharp and assessing, before softening into charm. "And who's this? The girl you risked it all for?" I wanted to shrink under his gaze, but Daniel pulled me close. "Emily, she's with me." Victor offered us a room upstairs, food, clothes that didn't smell of prison or the monastery. For a while, I allowed myself to believe this was the safe harbor Daniel had promised. We shared stolen meals, brief laughter, and whispers of plans for the future. But shadows gathered quickly. Harold Grant, Victor's partner, was less welcoming. He watched me with a sly smile. Ask questions Daniel always cut short. One evening, Harold cornered me in the hallway, his breath thick with whiskey. "You know who your husband was, don't you?" he asked. "Richard Cole. The man's got files, records, connections. You could be very useful to us." I pushed past him, unsettled, but the seed was planted. Soon Victor himself began hinting at the same thing. Over drinks with Daniel, he said, "Richard owes me. With the right information, we can bring him down, or at least profit from him. Emily's the key. She knows his world." Daniel argued, his voice rising. "She's not getting dragged into this. She's been through enough." But I could see the tension building, could feel the air shift. Victor's hospitality curdled into something else, expectation, demand. Then, one night, everything unraveled. Police sirens wailed outside the bar. Doors slammed. Before I could react, officers swarmed the place and Daniel was dragged away in handcuffs. I screamed his name, fought to reach him, but Victor held me back with a firm grip on my arm. "Easy now," he murmured, though his smile never touched his eyes. "He'll be fine. But if you want him out sooner rather than later, you're going to help us." My stomach dropped. "Help you how?" Harold appeared from the shadows, his tone slick. "Richard Cole. His company. His secrets. You can get close in ways we never could. You bring us what we need, and maybe your boy walks free again." I felt the walls closing in. After everything, escaping Richard, fleeing Patricia, finding Daniel, I was right back in chains. Different faces, same prison. My chest tightened as I realized Victor wasn't a friend. Not anymore. He had waited just long enough to trap us both. That night, as I lay awake in the room above the bar, Daniel gone and the city pressing in outside, I felt despair crash over me like a wave. Betrayed again, cornered again, forced once more to play a part in someone else's game. Hope slipped through my fingers, leaving only the bitter taste of fear. The days after Daniel's arrest blurred together. I stayed in the cramped room above Victor's bar, listening to the shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, the laughter of men downstairs, the clink of glasses. Each sound reminded me that I was trapped. Victor's promises of help had dissolved into threats, and Harold's eyes followed me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I felt caged again, just as I had under Richard's roof, except now Daniel was gone and I was utterly powerless. One afternoon, while I sat in the corner of the kitchen, trying to eat a piece of bread I could hardly swallow, a woman slid a plate in front of me. She was middle-aged, with lines of weariness etched into her face, but her eyes were warm. "You need more than crumbs if you're going to survive here," she said quietly. Her name was Linda Moore. She worked as the cook, serving meals to men who never thanked her and barely noticed her presence. But she noticed me. Over the next few days, she found excuses to linger by my side, slipping me extra food, whispering gentle words when no one else was listening. She asked nothing about my past, only studied the heaviness in my eyes as if she understood it without explanation. One evening, when the kitchen finally quieted, she leaned across the counter. "I can tell you don't belong here," she murmured. "And I think you're in trouble deeper than you realize. But I know someone who can help." I wanted to laugh, bitter and hopeless. "No one can help me," I said. "Not anymore." She shook her head. "My son, Ethan, is a lawyer. He's young, but he's smart, and he still believes in justice. He won't look the other way." Her words sparked something I hadn't felt in weeks, doubt in my despair. Could there really be someone willing to fight for us? The next day, Linda arranged for me to meet him. Ethan Moore was nothing like the men who surrounded Victor. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his suit a little worn but neat, his handshake firm. His eyes met mine without judgment. "My mother told me enough to know you're in danger," he said. "Tell me about Daniel." For the first time, I recounted everything. The trap Richard had set, the false charges, the escape, and the betrayal that led us back here. Ethan listened without interruption, only nodding as I spoke, his jaw tightening when Richard's name surfaced. When I finished, he leaned forward. If Daniel was framed, we can prove it. But I'll need your cooperation, and you'll need courage. Can you manage that? My throat tightened. Courage. The word felt foreign, but the way he spoke made it seem possible. Yes, I whispered. For Daniel, yes. Within days, Ethan arranged visitation at the jail. I saw Daniel through the thick glass, his eyes tired but fierce when they found mine. I pressed my hand against the cold barrier, wishing I could reach him. We're not done, I said. We're going to fight this. And for the first time since I had fled Richard's house in the dead of night, I believed it. Hope flickered, fragile but alive, a single flame refusing to be snuffed out. Ethan worked quickly, his determination sharper than anything I had seen in months. Together, we began searching for the women who had once stood where I had. Richard Cole's wives. It wasn't easy. Some had vanished into silence, their families protecting them, ashamed or afraid. But we found two who were willing to speak. The first lived in a small assisted living facility on the outskirts of the city. Her hands trembled as she poured tea, her voice low, halting. "He destroyed me," she whispered, her eyes unfocused as though still trapped in the past. The things he did, the things he made me endure. They said I was crazy, but I wasn't. He wanted me out of the way. Her medical records told the rest. Injuries consistent with abuse, hospitalizations that began the moment she married him. The second woman was more defiant, though her face carried the scars of what she had survived. "Richard Cole is a monster," she spat. "Everyone in Cleveland knows it, but no one dares say it. He pays, he threatens. He ruins anyone who stands in his way. You want proof? I'll give you proof." She handed Ethan copies of documents she had hidden, receipts, photographs, even a diary filled with entries that painted a clear picture of Richard's brutality. As I listened to their stories, my hand shook. Not because I doubted them, but because I saw myself in every word. That could have been me, locked in a hospital ward, discarded as if I were nothing more than broken glass. Rage burned through me, steady and controlled. For the first time, I felt the shift, no longer a victim cowering in shadows, but someone gathering weapons of truth. Ethan compiled everything, page after page, until he had a stack of evidence thick enough to crush the lies Richard had built his empire on. Then he looked at me. "It's time," he said, "but you need to be the one who faces him. He needs to see that you're not afraid anymore." The thought of confronting Richard made my stomach knot, but I knew he was right. So one cold evening, Ethan arranged the meeting. We walked into Richard's office, the walls lined with polished wood, the air heavy with the scent of money and power. He sat behind his desk, smirking as if we were nothing more than nuisances. But when Ethan spread the files across the desk, Richard's smirk faltered. He flipped through the photographs, the hospital records, the sworn testimonies. His hands tightened on the pages, his knuckles white. "You think this will hold up?" he sneered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "I don't think, Richard. I know. And if you don't cooperate, if you don't help reopen Daniel's case, every word, every photograph, every bruise will be dragged into the light. Your name, your company, your legacy, it will all burn." For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. He looked from me to Ethan, back again, and then he leaned back in his chair, defeated. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll make the calls. I'll do what you want." In that moment, standing across from the man who once held my life in his fists, I felt something shift inside me. I had been his possession, his victim, his discarded bride. Now, I was the one holding power. For the first time, Richard Cole bowed his head. And for the first time, I tasted revenge, not wild or vengeful, but sharp, precise, like justice finally breathing. The weeks that followed felt like moving through a storm. But this time I wasn't being carried away, I was steering. Ethan filed petitions, presented the evidence, and pressed every contact he had. One by one, The pieces of Richard's carefully built image began to crack. His name, once spoken with respect in Cleveland's business circles, was now whispered with suspicion. Articles appeared in the papers, rumors spread, and doors that had always opened for him began to close. At the same time, Daniel's case was finally reopened. I attended every hearing, my heart in my throat, my hands trembling in the cold air of the courthouse. Ethan argued with a fire I had never seen before, laying out each document, each testimony, each truth that Richard had buried. And for once, people listened. For once, Daniel's voice was not drowned out by money and power. The day the judge announced the decision, I could hardly breathe. In light of new evidence, he said, the conviction of Daniel Hayes is overturned. He is hereby declared innocent and released. The words washed over me like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Tears blurred my vision as the bailiff opened the gate and Daniel stepped forward, free at last. I ran to him, and for a moment the world disappeared. His arms closed around me, warm and solid, and I pressed my face into his chest. "We made it," I whispered, though my voice cracked. "We survived." Behind us, Richard's empire crumbled. He tried to salvage his reputation, but the weight of truth was too heavy. His business partners withdrew, his name became poison, and his influence faded. Patricia, too, vanished from my life. I heard whispers that she had taken what little she had and left town, unwilling to face the shame of her betrayal. I didn't care where she went. For the first time, I was free from her chains. Daniel and I walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand. The air was sharp, the Ohio wind biting at our faces, but I had never felt more alive. Snow flurries swirled in the late afternoon light, and I leaned into him, savoring the warmth of his presence. For so long, I had known nothing but fear, betrayal, and silence. Now I knew hope. We stood there on the courthouse steps, not talking about the future, not making promises we weren't ready to keep. Instead, we simply held each other, as if our very survival was proof enough. The road ahead was uncertain. Jobs, homes, a life rebuilt from ashes. But none of it seemed impossible, not with Daniel's hand clasped in mine. "I don't know where we'll go from here," I admitted softly, watching our breath rise in the winter air. Daniel pressed a kiss against my hair. "Wherever it is, we'll go together." And that was enough, because even after betrayal from blood and the cruelty of men who thought they owned the world, we had found something worth holding on to. Love, justice, the strength to rise again. No matter what waited in the years to come, I believed now, truly, that we would face it side by side.